I have to hit the button, go live. Here we go.
Oh, so it gives you a chance to preview it before you
Yeah,
actually go live.
so
That's
yes, that
smart.
is what I expected to happen the first time. I wasn't 100% off. But yeah, that's where I was at. So, all right, we are confirmed that we are live. We see it. Awesome.
We are
Okay.
live. We're totally
Hello,
live. We're
everyone.
so live.
Yes, that's good. All right. Hey, my name is Brooks. If you can't tell, I'm the newest person here. I am the developer relations manager for the Remix team. Been on the team for about a month and a half, I think now, almost like 2 months, which is crazy. And yeah, I'm joined with Michael Jackson, co-founder of Remix,
Hi, everybody.
Pedro, who is famous for making HDR in Remix, famous to me at least for
Hey
that.
everyone.
And then Mark Daglish, who is just all around amazing human, but also has been doing a lot with Vite. And that's what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about the new Vite, the new Remix plugin for Vite. And so we figured it'd be good to get the team who's worked on this the most together and talk about why are we adding a Vite plugin? What does this mean for the future of Remix? Why didn't we do this before? All those good questions. And I think that first one is what I want to kick off to you, Michael. Why are we doing this just now? Why didn't we do this before? Why now?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I think I've been a little bit kind of like the stick in the mud when it comes to the compiler. People have been asking us for a very long time, like, please, when will you open up the compiler? Please, sir, can I have a custom ES build plugin in there, or a Webpack plugin, or some custom behavior? And we haven't done it for a long time until today. The truth is, if you look back at the history of the Remix project, this is actually our fourth incarnation of the compiler. It started out as a Webpack plugin. We were just using Webpack, and then we moved to Rollup, and then ES Build, came out, and it was the fastest and most awesome thing that we'd ever seen. So we started using ES Build. The entire time, up until about, up until we joined Shopify, we were a startup, and we weren't really trying to innovate in the compiler space. We were trying to innovate in the runtime space. We were trying to make the best framework that we possibly could. We were using, we were innovating in a lot of areas. I wasn't really super interested in innovating in the compiler space. So, not opening up the compiler actually, I think, was a good decision early on, because it allowed us to remain, free to make these kinds of decisions without disrupting the ecosystem too much. When we made those switches to the different compilers, there was very little thrashing. And even today, now that we're releasing the Vite compiler, or the Vite plugin for Remix, I think is a little more accurate to say it that way. There's not going to be a whole lot of thrashing, not going to be a whole lot of stuff that you have to change in your code, right? Because we can just tell Vite to do everything the way that we were doing it. So anyway, we didn't have a whole lot of resources to dedicate towards compilers. We weren't actually trying to innovate in that space. There are a couple of different reasons, right? But the short story is, I think it worked out, because we've gotten to a good place now where where we can actually open up the compiler, and instead of opening up with our own sort of custom plugin API, we can open up on top of a really solid foundation that already has a massive community around it, which is Vite.
Nice. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I'm just curious. I don't even know this answer necessarily. Did you experiment at all with like creating your own plugin system or anything like that? Were there any other things you tried, or was it always just Remix compiler, totally we own this thing, and then Vite just
We
seemed
had
like the perfect choice?
Yeah, we had some thoughts, around, when people started asking us for compiler plugins, we were thinking, well, we're built on ES Build, maybe, that seems like a decent plugin API. Maybe we just open that up. But again, we weren't really trying to innovate in the compiler space. So I
Right.
I didn't want to have, Remix compiler plugins. Like, I didn't want that to even be a thing, because once you have that, now you have to support it. Now you have to evolve that API. You have to fix problems with it, bugs, etc. Also, I wasn't 100% sure that ESBuild's plugin API was like that, like the one that we wanted to adopt. Sure. Looking at what Vite has done, they've adopted the roll-up plugin API, which I think is also a good one. I've used them all. I think the rollup plugin API is really nice and flexible and powerful, and so getting on top of Vite actually allows us to take advantage of a huge ecosystem of rollup plugins that have been built over many years. I think, for example, like the markdown support, for example, in Remix, is really just the MDX rollup plugin, right? Mm-hmm. So there's things like that, things that we're seeing now that we're on top of the Vite and / rollup ecosystem, that are really, really nice advantages of making this move.
It's awesome. Yeah, it makes sense. So yeah, another question I have, and probably a lot of people have, I know Anthony Grand on Twitter asked this question, is, are there any trade-offs to switching to Vite? Is there anything that maybe we're giving up by making this move, or that if someone's looking into this and excited about the news, but not sure if it's time for their project maybe to move?
Yeah, so I think I can take that one.
Sure.
So I think that the biggest trade-off that we see right now is that Vite uses rollup as its bundler for production. And so your prod builds will probably be slower than they were with ESBuild. But there's good news there, which is that Vite is already working on this, right? That's why they're working on roll down. And to us, that trade-off of making the prod builds a couple seconds slower or whatever it is worth it to unblock like sub 100 millisecond dev flow time, right? Like getting HMR really firing on all cylinders is worth it for that. So that's the main, I think, trade-off most people see right away, is the prod builds being a little bit slower. The second trade-off that I think I see, this is kind of a technical point, but in development, Vite isn't bundling at all. And what that means is that if you're trying to do any cross-module optimizations of your code, like if you're doing tree shaking across modules and stuff like that, that's not something that Vite's going to just do for you in development out of the box. We used to rely on that feature actually of ESBuild in order to get HDR to be super granular and to just fetch the data that you needed when you change things in Remix. But with Vite, we can't rely on that because of the reasons I just mentioned. So we're just refetching every time you make a change, which, is overfetching, sure. But at the end of the day, we're trying to emulate what live reload does while preserving browser state. We're not really trying to solve the problem of overfetching via Vite, right? Okay. There's other ways to solve that overfetching problem, and we want to tackle those kind of from first principles, but independently as their own solutions. So that could come in the form of like dev tools or even userland solutions. Like you could have an MSW cache that you set up, and then you can invalidate it whenever you want. And that way you're not like hitting your slow loaders every time, right? So there's lots of ways to solve that problem. So yeah, those are the two main trade-offs: the slow prod builds and this really technical point about cross-module tree shaking in development mode.
Cool.
There's one other trade-off that just hit me as well, which is like, as we move to Vite, it means that we're giving up, to some degree from a Remix perspective, we're giving up a bit of control over the full end-to-end developer experience. Like, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it just means that you're more explicitly now calling out to Vite rather than Remix. I do think that's a good thing, but it comes with, it's a trade-off in the sense that, if you're using the Remix compiler today and something goes wrong, it's clearly like a Remix problem, which is bad for us. That's part of why we want to move to Vite, I guess. But the flip side is, it means from a consumer perspective, if you're using Vite with a Remix plugin and a bunch of other plugins, there is potential now where if something goes wrong, it's not clear whose fault it is. Is it Remix? Is it Vite? Is it one of my plugins? I think that's a good trade-off, but it is definitely something to be aware of, and it could make maintenance a little harder for us, at least in the short term as people migrate over. But we're hoping that in practice it's not too big of a deal, or at least it'll be less difficult for us to manage than owning the entire end-to-end experience. So yeah, I think that's another thing to be aware of.
And I want to add to that, which is that one thing that we've been struggling with in the current compiler is giving people tools for diagnosing their own problems, right? So we recently had added bundle analysis, right? So you got like a meta file for your bundles. But even just knowing that under the hood, Remix is doing 3 different compilations in the current compiler is like surprising to a lot of people, right? So like it's actually not really trivial to use that information. And then timing is even harder. Whereas when we're in Vite, there's already existing plugins for profiling and for debugging and inspecting things in your plugins. So finding those bottlenecks and stuff like that, I think it's going to be, I mean, let's see how it pans out, but I think it's really promising with Vite.
Yeah, it's nice. Yeah, it's like it's really exciting, but also I feel like there's always unknowns with that of like Remix is opening itself up to almost an entirely like new ecosystem and new community. And with that, it's like a lot of problems Remix just gets to say like we don't have to worry about that anymore is the impression I'm getting. But at the same time, it's like, okay, well, we still need to like educate users. We still need to figure out where are those kind of those rough places. Is that kind of the impression I'm getting?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, cool. It's really exciting. This another kind of good question that yeah, I heard was or rather with moving to Vite, like this is a pretty big change for how kind of Remix was maybe thinking about the compiler. Has this move to Vite forced Remix to consider any of its other previous opinions?
Do you want to talk about some of the CSS stuff, Mark? I think you've got context on that.
To me, yeah, obviously I'm historically quite invested in the CSS space, but I think, when it comes to Remix versus like Remix compiler versus Vite, this is one of the biggest changes I've seen is that, Remix had its own baked in views about what it means to import a CSS file. And so in the Remix compiler, importing a CSS file gives you the href to put in the link tag, basically.
Right.
And this is one of the nice things about Remix is it gives you that low level control over the network tab, as we say. So you get to control, if I import a CSS file, like which route ultimately is in charge of rendering the link tag for that CSS file and so on. And you can it's a first class concept, you can export that from a component and pass that on to the parent route and so on. But I guess the challenge is that if again, it speaks to the trade-off. If we're trying to go more with the grain of the community and take advantage more of these sort of de facto standard tools, which Vite very much is becoming in the framework space, it means that to go with the grain of Vite, we really need to switch more to the default being CSS imports as side effects and not manually managing the link tags. Vite does let you explicitly ask for the URL of a CSS file with like question mark URL on the end of the import path. But there are some actually, like, basically there's a bug with that at the moment that we're following up with the Vite team about, which is that CSS imported in that way, which is more the classic Remix style, doesn't go through their CSS like transformation pipeline. So it's not, you get the raw CSS content. So if that's what you want, then that will work. But if you want to go through post CSS or even like Sass and other tools like that, but still have that classic Remix style of getting the URL, support for that may come in the future in Vite, or potentially you could even build your own Vite plugin to achieve the same thing. I feel like that's probably possible. But like I said, it's in the short term, at least, it's better for us to go with the grain of saying import CSS as side effects and let the Remix plugin behind the scenes will map those imports to the correct routes for you. So we've actually added an extra ability to Remix Core, which is that you can now, like if there's a bundler integration on top of the Remix Core, like we have with the Vite plugin, it has the ability to attach CSS side effects as part of the build to the routes that they belong to, which is what, but again, this is going with the grain of the community. I think this is what you see with other frameworks out there that have nested routing and CSS side effect imports. So it's getting us closer to what people expect, but it's definitely a change from what we've said in the past about how to think about CSS.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. I'm curious.
One
Michael,
other,
Oh, good.
I was going to say there's one other big opinion that we've kind of evolved our thinking on, which is historically, Remix has taken a very strong stance about making dev as close to prod as possible. And we still think that that is a super worthy goal, and we want to stick as close to that as we can. But basically what we were finding was that if you just take this, very simple and effective approach of just rebuilding whenever you need to pick up changes, and then doing, you can do fancy things behind the scenes to pick up those changes dynamically, but you're just rebuilding at the end of the day. If you're doing that, you need to reprocess your entire app every single time you do that. Or at least if you're using ESBuild, for example, that's what will happen. And that's one of the motivations that led us to exploring Vite, was that a bunch of these dependencies were huge, right? Like you pull in this like giant styling or component library with a bunch of barrel exports, and then suddenly like your build just slows down to a crawl. And so Mark and I were looking into pre-bundling those dependencies. And so we're like, okay, how can we do that? But already when you're pre-bundling dependencies, you are bundling them independently of your app, which is different than what it would be in prod, right? So you're already deviating a little bit from what it would be like in prod. And even if we did that, we were just building a worse version of it than what Vite has. And this sort of story repeats itself a lot. There's a lot of little features like that we wanted to add to our compiler, and each one of them was really pulling us away from that idea. But at the end of the day, like dev versus prod is still really near and dear to our hearts. We want to make dev and prod as close as possible. So really the stance that we're taking here is, the network tab for your assets might look a little bit different because they're being chunked differently in dev and prod. But that's actually really similar, I think, philosophically to minification, right? Like you might not want to minify in dev and you do in prod, and you kind of trust that things work out and that it's not going to affect too much, right? Obviously, in this case, the chunking affects the file size, and maybe you could argue that lets you, that makes it a little bit further from dev. But I think at the end of the day, it's a really good trade-off, right? The DX that you get is great, and you can still look at your prod build locally whenever you want. You can run build, and then you can run start, and you can do that. So we're not removing that ability from you. We're just making the default option in development much snappier, right, with these trade-offs.
Well, and I know that this dev versus prod builds thing is I know that we align with the Vite team on that as well, right? I've seen various comments from people who work on Vite that to that effect, basically saying that that they wish that it was closer, but that the reasons for the, there are good reasons right now for why dev isn't exactly what production is, and so forth. So it's not like, I think we're all going into this, with our eyes wide open. We're not getting like tricked into doing something in dev that we would never ever want to do. Right. We're acknowledging the difference here and the trade-off, and we think that it's worth it in this case.
Makes a lot of sense. So following along with this whole idea of, okay, there is a lot of excitement for Vite, and that is really exciting, but the road here was a really long one before the Remix team felt comfortable making that decision. I guess what I'm wondering is what prevents Remix from potentially moving to another compiler one day, or does nothing prevent it? And that's tech, and that's the march that we I guess just a little bit of words to that.
So I think, we learned a lot building Remix V1 and V2. We learned a lot about, the type of framework that we actually want to be building at the end of the day. I think the fact that we bought into a bundler at all was we were just kind of going with the flow of this is the state of web development. A lot of people use Webpack, etc. So, we're just kind of going to go with the flow and let people import their CSS files, and now they have a web app. Remix, the future of Remix, and you've seen Ryan talk about this as well. The future of Remix is that the core of Remix, right? Not all of it, but the core of Remix is going to target runtime APIs. So in other words, you want to write a test for your Remix route. you're not going to have to run a build before you go and run your tests, right? Because all of the core of Remix is just going to be runtime APIs. So at most, what you're going to have to do is maybe put in a loader in Node to handle your JSX and your TypeScript, which at this time are just kind of table stakes for JavaScript. That's just kind of how JavaScript has evolved. But so the core of Remix will target these runtime APIs. So then, what about the rest of your app, right? The rest of your app is CSS, is, bundling the assets, deploying for production. For that, I think that Vite does a great job. And like I said, it's got a community around it. I mean, part of the reason for the timing of this switch is that we can see that there has been so much support for Vite, that there's a great community around it. So, by buying into Vite at this time, whereas like even just 2 years ago, it really wasn't that clear. Pedro outlined a lot of the timeline in his blog post on that we published this morning. In order for Vite to kind of get to the point where where it could do SSR and it could do all the things that we needed it to do, and for us to have the confidence that it was really going to be around for a long time. I mean, plus the fact that Astro's using it and Svelte is using it. Like, I feel like it's really got a lot of good support from the community. Shopify is now sponsoring the project as well. So I think Vite has a nice long future runway in front of it. So I'm not concerned really at all about, us having to switch to a different compiler anytime in the near future. I guess for those two reasons. One is we are ourselves relying a lot less on compilers, so that de-emphasizes the importance of the compiler and the overall architecture of Remix. And two, Vite is an awesome compiler with great support, great community support, and they've been great to work with up to this point. So like, why, what I can't see anything coming in the future that would ever force us to say like, oh, you know what, we actually need to switch this again. Having said that, obviously there's always stuff that you can't foresee, but I just don't see it happening right now.
And I think, looking at it from two different lenses, like, because there's how it impacts users and there's also how it impacts us, right? So for us, you might be like, oh, is Remix going to spend a bunch of time re-implementing and that's instead of working on core features, and that's, maybe a waste. To that, I'd say we've implemented Remix in different compilers like 5 times now. We're pretty good at it now.
Yeah,
a lot of practice.
Yeah.
But I think, and so you shouldn't feel bad for us. We can do that. And if you look at like the ES build compiler we have today, like 90% of it isn't for doing Remix things, right? Like we were saying before, it was to like make sure plugins were working, and polyfills were working, or making sure that imports for PNG files were working, or coordinating all these builds and that's just
node
not
modules, your other third-party packages, right? That they're working.
Exactly.
Right?
And so getting out of the compiler game and becoming a plugin completely like gets us out of there. But I think the other thing too to consider is like, okay, what if I'm a user? What if I'm not worried about you guys doing too much work? What if I just want to make sure you're not going to break me, a year later when Remix moves on to Voot instead of Vite or whatever the next thing is, right? Like at that point, the thing to consider is that we're really just a Vite plugin, and the Vite plugin API is like resolve, load, transform, and like spin up a dev server, right? So like, as long as the successor to Vite has a plugin API that's like that or more powerful than that, we will be able to plug into it, and that shouldn't be painful. And so I feel really confident that anything that's going to dethrone Vite, which right now I can't see anything on the horizon like that,
right?
It would have to be like that, right? It would have to probably support Vite plugins on day one, otherwise no one's going to use it. But even if it doesn't, it'd have to match that plugin API to some degree.
That makes sense.
I think.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to add. I mean, I think we're saying a lot of the same things, but just to add as well, like to me, this fits in with this what we were talking about before about going with the grain of the community and trying to have fewer opinions that are like Remix specific, because it means that Yeah, because that ties into us being just a plugin. Because now, if you want to integrate with a different build tool, you don't have to like emulate the opinions of the remix compiler, because there are none anymore. Like, we were super brutal on ourselves about like what opinions can we pull out of this thing and make it so that ultimately, like, if you want to add that opinion, it's Vite, you can do it. And so now it's much easier for either us or the community to adapt the remix core to something else.
That makes sense. Like that. I think Michael and Ryan just need to make a stack with all of their opinions, and that's just like the original remix, like how they did it, and then we could just kind of keep that. And then here's like, okay, here's how everyone else like all the nice stuff they want for the dev experience.
No, you don't want that. It would change. It would.
It's also fair.
Ask Mark. Mark built what was it? React Router Mega Demo. Mark built the whole site on that architecture, and then everything changed.
Ooh. Oh man, that's, I think, another conversation for
But that stack
day.
at one point in time was all of our opinions.
That's awesome. Okay, let's talk a little bit about performance. I think that's the thing that people get most excited about, even though, I mean, experience is really important, but to me, the plugin system that's really exciting, but performance is also really exciting. I've heard, I think, Pedro, you mentioned that we're getting like HMR at like 50 milliseconds right now, which is awesome. But I believe like 16 is considered the benchmark fast for HMR. Can you explain why is there a difference there? What's going on with that discrepancy in numbers?
Yeah. So Jared from Bun, he posted something about like 16 milliseconds is what you should shoot for HMR.
Okay.
And I totally agree. But we're not going from 20 milliseconds to 16 here. The previous remix experience was not as fast as it could be, right? So people, in some cases, again, because we were having to rebuild the entire app to do some of this stuff on slower machines, it could take many seconds. So for us, like getting down to 16, absolutely, that's where we want to be in the long term. But right now we've gotten it to sub 200 really repeatably. And so that sub 200 includes a bunch of stuff. It's not just HMR. Like I said earlier, we're actually refetching server data, right? So the server needs to be updated. Then we need to refetch fresh data. Then we need to update the router. And then we perform React Fast Refresh. So we're not just doing that last step. We're doing way more than that. And we're still doing it in sub 200 milliseconds, at least on the machines I've seen. Obviously, that's going to vary with different hardware. But the big thing to call out here is Vite has unlocked our capacity to do things on demand and per route. So we don't have to do the whole app at once. We're not all the way there yet. Right now, I think we are processing pretty much the entire server build because we need to, like, now that we've got Vite, we can start whittling away at that and do less and less and less and make it faster. But right now, that's what's happening. So, and then for the 50 millisecond mark, that's probably what people are seeing in their network tab or something like that.
Okay.
But we did a test of measuring, like we took a timestamp. We wrote a little script that takes a timestamp, then updates your app, and then the browser re-renders that thing, and then that shows a timestamp as well. So it's kind of hard to measure these things, but we're trying to get at, I edit code, I see the change on screen. How fast is that? Right. And so on like my M1 Max MacBook Pro, we were seeing around 100 milliseconds, maybe 150 on slow ones, maybe 50 seconds on fast ones, which, like I said, not the 16 that you might want to be at for HMR, but we're doing way more than that. And it is just miles faster than what we had before. So we're shipping that. I have no qualms about that.
Cool. All right. I mean, that sounds awesome.
I think maybe the last two things to add is there's like some low hanging fruit there, which is there's a project called Vite Node, which is part of Vite, and that helps you update the server faster. We're not using that yet.
Okay.
We're using Babel for our React refresh transforms under the hood instead of SWC. That's like another piece of low hanging fruit. So there's a lot we can do.
Okay. Cool.
And we just haven't gotten there yet, but we're feeling really good about where we are with just the trivial implementation that we have.
That extra 34 milliseconds though, man. That 34 milliseconds.
Yeah, come on.
I'm probably gonna lose interest in what I'm doing, close the editor, get up and walk away.
Michael, the solution is to buy a $10,000 black MacBook, and then you won't have that problem.
There, nice. There we go. That is it. Oh man. No, that's pretty cool. That makes sense. Yeah, that there's kind of a lot going on there. I guess following up on that that I've seen this question come up a lot, both on Twitter and even in the YouTube kind of comments we're getting right now. It sounds like, Pedro, you're aware of like a lot of things that still could be done. I assume you as well, Mark. But I'm curious, is that the reason this is currently unstable? Is just because you have a lot of this low hanging fruit? Are there other reasons? I just see a lot of people being like, give me now. Like, why isn't this already ready in production? So what's the reason for the unstable flag? Any estimate on how long that'll be there? Just give us the high level. No, we won't hold you to this, but what's the overall roadmap for this thing?
You want to take a crack at that, Mark?
Yeah. To me, the unstable, I mean, pragmatically, like with a big feature like this, marking it unstable at a high level is just giving us the freedom to say, like, look, it's early. Don't go shipping this to production yesterday necessarily. Like, we want to work with the community to make sure it's working the way you expect, that it's well within reason that there are things that we missed that are really critical to being stable. It's all the usual things you might expect in that sense. So this is just us saying, like, we want to get it in your hands as soon as possible. We want the community playing with it, helping us find our blind spots. And so then because that's really where the reasoning is coming from, less so because we think that, the APIs are necessarily going to change in a big way. I think the APIs we have seem pretty stable to me. To me, it's more about saying, okay, once we've got a sense of the community using it and we've worked through maybe some of those early teething issues, then it's just it's more of a gut feeling, I think, to me, because of that. It's not, there's no sort of hard line. We'll just play it by ear and see at what point do we feel like we're comfortable telling everybody this is now the thing you should be using. So yeah, it's going to need feedback from the community. So if you're listening, obviously you're part of this community in some sense. Try it out. Let us know what you think. If there's anything missing, anything that could be better, let us know. And once we've hit that point of just feeling good about where it's at, then we can move on to the next step.
The point about the APIs is also, like, I agree with Mark. The shape, like, abstractly what they do, we feel really solid on. I could definitely see myself renaming them before we stabilize, and even that we're sensitive to, right? Like, we want to keep our reputation for having boring releases, right? So we definitely want to do that during unstable if we can. And that actually leads into a really interesting point, which is a lot of other frameworks, and I could be wrong, like, there probably are some out there, but a lot of other frameworks don't support the custom server use case that Remix does, right? So Remix is, at the end of the day, a request handler, and you get to, like, plug it into whatever you want. And that means that you can own your server. You can write a server.ts file and put Express in there and do whatever you want. So we had to make sure we had runtime APIs that let you hook into Vite's power at dev time, right? And that's not something we invented. Like, if you look at Vite's SSR plugin, like, examples, we basically just did what they did, but just abstracted a little bit away that you shouldn't worry about. Okay. But that is something we had to do, right? And so feels pretty stable, but I wouldn't bet my house on it right now, right? Like, so I just want to battle test it a little bit more before we finalize that.
How much would you bet on it? No, I'm just kidding.
I would bet my laptop, but maybe not my car.
Oh, okay.
The other thing that I think could possibly change is, right now, we recommend that you just run Vite. Like, from the command line, we recommend you run the Vite CLI. We've talked about that. I don't know if it'll stay that way, or if it's a better user experience to just run the Remix CLI for everything, because as it stands now, you're going to run the Vite CLI for some things and the Remix CLI for other things. And I think personally, it might feel a little more cohesive if you were just running the Remix CLI for all things, but then it's not just Vite, right? It's like a little wrapper around. Anyway, just cosmetic stuff, really. Like, when Pedro's talking about possibly renaming some things, I think that's another reason for the unstable, is there are a few cosmetic things that I think may change.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I was gonna add that point too about the you call into Vite directly now. That's something we not only we discussed, but we actually technically went back and forth on this during development. We originally, it was called out via remix. You would run remix dev in the CLI, and you would enable Vite via an environment variable. And it was very late in the piece that Pedro and I were debating this ourselves and trying to figure out, what do we do here? Because the code was basically just calling out to Vite. We'd got so much of the code, because it didn't start that way. As we iterated and we got more familiar with the way Vite worked, we realized more and more of the code that we had originally put in the CLI ended up, we could move it over into the plugin to the point where we were just calling Vite. And then we were thinking, well, this is where we get to take advantage of being unstable in a sense, because we were saying, okay, we're not committing to a final API here. And, what we want to do, part of this move is to say, we actually want you to feel like there's less to learn with Remix, right? Yeah. So like when you come to Remix now, if it's in a Vite world, it's like, oh, the part that's Remix just shrunk a lot compared to what I had before. And we felt like this extra step of saying, like, not only is there less to learn from a Remix perspective when it comes to the bundler, but like you don't even use the Remix CLI if you're just using Vite. And so I think we're kind of maybe trialing this a bit while we're unstable, just to get a sense of like, well, first of all, and again, this is where the feedback comes in. Yes. Does this feel natural to the community, or does it feel odd? Because I see arguments for both. So that's definitely something we'd love community feedback on. And there's still room for us to reverse this in the future. And we may even be forced to reverse this for technical reasons if the Vite build gets more complicated in the future as well. Because right now you have to run Vite build twice, and the second one has to be the SSR build. So there's a little bit of like technical detail maybe leaking to the consumer. That's where we were definitely on the fence with it. It's pretty simple though. It's just Vite build and Vite build -- SSR. So we felt like we kind of like the transparency of that, but we may be forced to put that behind our own CLI in the future. But that's where we're at.
One thing that's interesting there is like we now have a new entire pool of potential Remix users, which are if you're using Vite and you're using React Router and you want like a natural way to keep using Vite but get all the power of Remix, like now there's this new option available to you where you don't have to do as much work. Or even if you were just using React and you were using Vite, I mean, there are some great frameworks out there that do that, but now we're in that space too. And so that's like a different user, and that user probably would much prefer to just use Vite because they're familiar with it, right? So we have to strike a balance between like what existing users want and making sure that everyone's kind of happy there. So that's something we've definitely been thinking a lot about. I just saw like the tweet today from Matthias Patak, I think, on the Vite team that he was just saying like they were looking at React and Vite together and not really seeing a huge way forward. Like I don't know, I think he said like a year ago, and now suddenly like a bunch of these frameworks have come in and we're coming in, and the Vite plugin for React has been revamped, so it's looking way more fruitful there. So there's just a lot of people excited about Vite and React, and we have to take them into account too.
That's really cool. And honestly, like it makes me feel pretty confident when like something like a bundler is not tied to a specific framework or just flavor of how you build your website. And because it seems like bundlers should have kind of this core thing that is useful to all the different frameworks. So one that is not just catering to a specific community honestly makes me personally feel pretty confident if I were having to make a decision.
And again, Vite is now serving the needs of Remix, Svelte, and Astro, which is just going to make it great. I mean, this is just how stuff works. When you see forces like this line up in the ecosystem, and you see like different teams that are all working on the same problem, like those kinds of forces just sort of naturally make something really, really good, right, over time. And that's so from a kind of like a high level view, I kind of back up and I kind of look at these things and I think, oh yeah, Vite's going to be great. I mean, it's already is great, but it's going to be really, really great, with everybody working on it.
That's so much of how we were able to get to where we are so quickly, is because there's so much prior art in the community, other frameworks solving the same problems we have. I mean, we really can't shout out enough, like, thanks to the Vite community, like the core maintainers and also maintainers of other frameworks. I mean, off the top of my head, like the one that was most prominent for me, there's plenty of other examples I could come up with, but like, with Vite, the way it handles CSS in dev means that you get out of the box, you get a flash of unstyled content if you're doing server rendering. And Solid Start already solved this.
Oh,
and
nice.
we were basically able to just go and reference their implementation. So yeah, I mean, like big shout out to them. And they're not the only ones that helped us in that way. So yeah,
That's right. I forgot about Solid.
It's really reassuring for us to be part of that broader community now. It means we get to it's a double win. It's like we get the benefit of the Vite community broadly, but also as framework maintainers, we've got a bunch of other frameworks that are working in the same space, even if it's with a different library like Solid versus React. A lot of the core problems are still the same. And it's not just that the code is open, but the community is very open as well. As we've been working through these problems and chatting about them in Discord, people who work on other frameworks have been answering our questions about how best to use Vite. So it's a really strong community, and it puts us in a really good position to move forward with Vite.
That's so cool. Love it. Okay, there we are running out of time. I knew we were gonna do this. So I do want to get to some questions from Twitter. Just some folks on there were asking questions, as well as questions I'm seeing in the YouTube. One question kind of follows up on something that was kind of briefly mentioned, how one really cool thing about Remix, and a big reason I fell in love with it, is the fact that it's bring your own server. It's, you can deploy anywhere as long as it's like a JS runtime is pretty much the only limitation at this point. However, I do hear that Cloudflare might be a bit of a problem in this new Vite world. So can someone assure me that I don't need to be worried there? What's the plan there? What's the latest on that development?
Yeah, sure. So historically, and again, this can change like day to day. I checked last time like a couple months ago, so this could have already changed. But historically, a lot of the frameworks were using Miniflare v2, which is kind of like an emulation layer for Cloudflare that you can run it in Node. And they were doing that in development. And that was actually one of the reasons why originally Remix didn't want to move to Vite right away, was we didn't like that answer. That was too far along the dev prod chasm for us. And so we were really hesitant to do that. So we've been looking at how we can best support Cloudflare now, and we've actually talked to the Cloudflare core team and started working with them, and they're really keen on stopping use of Wrangler v2 and Miniflare v2 and all of these v2 libraries that they have. They consider them kind of stale. They're not maintaining them anymore. They want everyone to be on their v3 libraries. So we've been talking about how to do that, and the big challenge there is their worker D runtime is now powering Miniflare. It's not a node thing anymore. So that might be a little bit technical, but at the end of the day, what that means is like we need to coordinate two different runtimes in order to get this right in dev, which is what's hard. And so we're working with them to do that. We've got a plan for a short-term solution that'll be in Remix before it stabilizes Vite support. And what that's going to look like is you'll just like access your context in your loader or something like that, and that context object will have some of the Cloudflare APIs like KV store stuff that you can put and get stuff from there. And under the hood, that'll just be like something that proxies to that worker D process. So at the end of the day, that's how it's going to work. And that's really, really similar to how it works in Next today. So the Cloudflare team was saying that's how we've been doing it there. We want to port that solution to Remix as close to no changes as possible between those two. But in the long term, we really don't want to like be using this proxy object. It feels kind of hacky. Like we'd like a more principled solution there. So we're working with them for a longer term solution where Vite would get the get the request, and it would decide when to ask this worker D, this Miniflare process, to do some of the work, and when it wouldn't, right? Because really, like for asset handling, Vite can just do that. That's not the server. It can just handle the assets. But for the SSR request and for loaders and for actions and for things like that, we want your actual app server, which in this case would be a Cloudflare thing, to be handling those things. So yeah, short story is we're going to get it working in stable, at least as good as what we think is best in class for now, which is very similar to what Next has. And then in the long term, we're going to actually be coordinating a worker D process more closely with Vite. And this is something that isn't Remix specific. So we're hoping that if we crack this with the Cloudflare team, that maybe this can, and like Mark was saying before, maybe we can share our learnings there with the other frameworks in the Vite community, because I think that'd be pretty sweet to get that working well.
That'd be awesome. Yeah, I'm sure there are plenty of other people would be really appreciative of that. And again, just goes to the point of it's a community, it's a whole ecosystem and community, and that's a really big deal. All right, Michael, I think this question is going to be a little bit towards you. So like_types said, Ryan Florence has teased about a no build option, but Remix relies on a compiler, whether it's ES build or Vite now. So they seem excited about this, but yeah, any idea about a no build option? What does that even mean exactly?
Oh, yeah. So DHH has been talking a lot about no build. I think he even used like a hashtag, like no build hashtag. I don't think that's, I mean, I don't read every single one of Ryan's tweets, but I don't think that's necessarily what Ryan has been talking about. Ryan is talking about Remix targeting runtime APIs.
Okay.
Which is slightly different. So, you know, the term no build means like, I'm just going to write JavaScript and CSS and use, you know, JavaScript modules and import and let the browser resolve those imports and who cares, right? Like about the waterfall and all of that. Like it's great. You can do modern development because these tools have evolved. And that's kind of what DHH is saying. That's what the no build thing is. When we're saying we want to target runtime APIs, think about it more like, you know, create element in JSX, right? Like you can use JSX. It's this nice like syntactic sugar. You can also make a React app without JSX if you really, really want to. You can just use create element, right? So that's a runtime API that you don't need a build for in order to use React, right? And so I think it's more along that vein that we're talking about when we're talking about, you know, targeting the runtime APIs, is that everything that you do in Remix, it's kind of harkens back to what I was saying earlier about, you know, you should be able to just run your tests without running a build, you know. Everything that we do in Remix you should be able to do it at runtime with a runtime API. You shouldn't need a build before you run your tests.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Thanks for clarifying that a bit.
Yeah.
All right. Kinsey Dodds asked, I think this will be a pretty easy one. I just asked to go into detail about the globals tricks. He says that he would love, let's see. So he often has to reconnect his database and the dev server, or has to do a trick to not reconnect it multiple times. It sounds like Vite just solves this. What's the deal there?
Yeah. So in our current compiler, what happens is we output kind of a single file for your whole server. So we bundle the server up. And if you look in build index.js, unless you've configured that, that's where your request handler is, and basically where most of your server is. And so whenever anything changes in your app, we overwrite that file. Like the whole file goes away, and then you get a new file.
And that's boots a new process, right?
And you're either restarting or you're doing, you know, some of the server side HMR stuff with the V2 dev server with manual mode, or you're doing something like that. So if you're restarting, like hopefully the connection's being torn down and then you're making a new one, but like, why can't you just reuse the one you just had, first of all? And then if you're using manual mode, like maybe you're creating multiple connections because you're not tearing those things down, right? So there's kind of like a stateful trick here of like, how do I make sure I only connect once, even across all of these code changes? So you previously had to do a bunch of these tricks with global and say global dot and put some underscored sentinel thing there. So you can read about that in like the manual dev mode docs and Remix. And it worked, you know, that trick worked. It kept things around so that you didn't reconnect. But with Vite, things are a little bit different and they're a little bit nicer. So Vite actually understands the module graph in the server and doesn't bundle it. And so it only actually will recompile, re-execute your server module if it changed. And since it's not bundling things, if you're changing other modules that affect the server, it's not having to re-execute all the modules. So if you have like a db.server.ts where you're connecting to your database, if you're not changing that file and you're changing other things, that file's not re-executed for every change. So you're not reconnecting to your database there. One slight nuance there is if you are changing that file, you might see multiple
Right.
connections. But the nice thing now is that you can just solve that problem with standard import meta hot APIs. You don't need Remix to solve this problem for you. You can just say import meta hot dot dispose, and you can say what should happen when this module gets updated and
Oh, that's
you need
really
to do
nice.
something
Like
about it.
like a cleanup essentially sort
Yeah,
of thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not sure if we have that like fully. I haven't tested that, but
Okay.
if that doesn't work, like that should work, and so we'll make it work.
Somebody,
But
yeah,
that's the
somebody break
idea.
it and put up an issue so Pedro will fix it for us.
Yeah, well, yeah. Well, I didn't even mention it, but yeah, like the idea philosophically is like just use the import meta hot API to handle when that file changes, and should just work.
Cool. That's awesome.
I think
That's super
actually
exciting.
one more thing to call there is
Sure.
that in ESM, if you're running your server with ESM, we were using this trick of busting the import cache by importing it with a query timestamp parameter or whatever. Even if you don't know what any of that means, what it means is that every time your server changed, we'd have to re-import your server build. And since you can't purge the import cache, your memory usage would grow over time. And then for some users, this could cause like an out of memory error for them. But with Vite, you're only getting rid of the little bit of code that changed and reinserting a new one. And it's actually not even hitting the import cache at all. It has its own kind of way of doing that in dev so they can manage the memory a little bit better. So that should mean like pretty much all the out of memory errors I've seen with Remix in dev should be gone. So that's really great.
That's awesome. Again,
Yeah.
somebody please break that, because the sooner you break it, the sooner we fix it, and the sooner we get stable Vite, right? That's what I'm hearing. So sweet. Okay, I think we got one last question I think we can end on. So Alex Anderson asked, when do we plan to deprecate and then remove the current Remix compiler? I think there's an implicit question in there. Do we plan to deprecate and remove the Remix compiler with this change? And if so, is that V3? Is that we don't know? Yeah.
Yeah, I can answer that. So the answer is yes. We do plan to deprecate and remove the current compiler. However, if you have been following Remix and you know how we do major version upgrades and with the feature flags and everything, you'll know that it's going to be a super smooth transition. So for one, the current Vite plugin should just work out of the box for most of your current Remix concerns, for most of your current Remix apps. So the transition to the new compiler should be very, very simple. We're going to flesh it out. We're going to make sure that it's nice and stable here in the next couple of months. Once that reaches stable, we'll let that bake for a few months, and then we'll deprecate the current compiler. You'll still be able to use it, obviously, but it'll just be deprecated. And then in V3, we'll remove the current compiler, and we'll just be a Vite plugin, because we don't have opinions about how you build your app.
Awesome. That's exciting. I think a lot of people are going to be looking forward to that, and definitely hoping for that kind of smooth transition. We'll definitely try to keep that up. So that's really cool.
Yep.
All right. Well, as we close up, I just wanted to give each of you kind of an opportunity to share. Is there anything that you are particularly excited about for this new plugin that we maybe haven't talked about yet? Anything that's on your mind of like, this really unlocks maybe this aspect, or anything like that? Maybe starting with you, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, to me, like it feels to me personally almost like the culmination of why I wanted to join the Remix team in the first place. Why this came up for me. I'm excited about Remix as a framework in general, but like the whole reason this came up for me as an opportunity is Kent, when he was on the Remix team, he kept tweeting about adding support for CSS modules and adding support for vanilla extract and so on. And it was like the fifth time I saw him talking about it that I was like, I DM'd him. I'm like, you should hire me to work on this stuff. I was sort of half joking. I didn't expect it to be taken seriously, but here I am. I mean, this to me speaks to, and we've had questions in this vein. This was my personal concern looking at Remix way back before I worked on it. Was I love the concept. I love the unique ideas that Remix brought to the table. But what concerned me was that lack of control relative to what I was used to. And I know it's a double-edged sword, having that much control over the build, and people can take it too far. But the flip side is like, it also gets you out of a bind sometimes. There's some obscure thing you're trying to do. And if you're using Webpack, you can, as I was earlier on at that time, you could configure your way out of all sorts of problems. And it felt like a big risk to me that it's like, by adopting this framework, I'm also having to change the level of control I have over my build, and it's a tough trade-off. And this really solves it to me in the best possible way. So I'm excited that it feels like now we're getting the absolute best of both worlds. Like, you've got such a great framework, and for a lot of people now, like, it's getting rid of this thing that was perhaps holding them back from switching over. And I'm hoping what that means is that we now have a much more community-oriented framework where people feel like they're not buying into such a holistic worldview, and that they're maintaining the control that they might have experienced previously. So I'm excited to see a whole bunch of new people come into the remix space as a result.
That's awesome. I'm gonna piggyback in there just because I can say, like, personal experience. I was at HEB, which is a large grocery store in Texas before, and really a big reason, if not the reason, we could not move to Remix, no matter how much fanboying and hyping I would do about it. The main reason was we were using a CSS and JS solution that just relied very heavily on a Babel plugin to make server-side rendering work, and to try and get that to work in Remix was basically a non-starter for us. Not saying HEB is going to use Remix now. I obviously don't have that power, but yeah, I'm really excited for it, just because this for me is a very personal reason I know we couldn't move forward, and I think that's just unblocks that for imagine so many companies, which is really exciting. Pedro, do you maybe want to share what you're most excited about that hasn't been shared already?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I worked a lot on the V2 dev server, and I'm really proud of the work we did there, but we also just we were trying to solve this problem of getting these server changes in the browser, and it was tough, and we wanted to support multiple runtimes. And so kind of conceptually, the solution we came up with, like I said, I'm really proud of it, but there were issues with it, and there are definitely people on less powerful machines or just different OSs that can run into race conditions that are super hard to replicate for us. And so it just kind of kills me when we have some users who are, seeing 400 millisecond refresh times, and they're pretty happy with it. They're always asking for more. But then we have other users that are seeing 20-second refresh times like that. That really hurts. So
yeah,
I really wanted to tackle that problem once and for all. And I think, we talked about no build, but the way you solve perf problems is you do less, right? And that's a big thing that Vite does for us, is it just does less in dev. So not only are we doing everything in memory now, not only are we not recomputing things, but we don't have a separate process right now. Obviously, with Cloudflare, that can change a little bit, but in general, we don't need a separate process. We're not doing communication through file system, which was causing all these race conditions. So at the end of the day, I think it's just going to make the experience so much better, not just for the top 20% of machines that are running Remix, but for all users that are running Remix. And that really makes me happy.
That's cool. All right, Michael, bring us home. What are you most excited about?
So I'm excited about, if I could say it in two words, it would be leverage and alignment. When I see, and we've said this already, but Remix is building on this great community project. We're contributing back, right? We're sponsoring the project. We're helping it. We've talked about this integration with Cloudflare that we're working on, right? We're going to work on this stuff, and everybody who's building on Vite is going to be able to benefit from that work. We're going to be able to benefit from them. So leverage, right? We're getting a lot of leverage through open source, which I think is, I've been doing open source for a long time, and that's where the magic really happens, is when you get a lot of people who are interested in it and solving the same problem. So we're going to get a ton of leverage there. And then alignment, I think, Shopify in general as a company, we're aligning around Vite and Remix. So, us making Vite or making it possible or easy to use Remix with Vite, I think makes a lot of sense, and it really aligns us really, really well with Shopify as an org. We are currently working on a React Router 6 app, which is our main admin dashboard at Shopify. It's a large app, right? This is like the app. This is like, when Facebook built Facebook.com with React, that's how come I trusted React, because I said, these people are proving out this technology, right? That's essentially what we're doing here at Shopify. We are proving out Remix with our core bread and butter technology, right? Our core stack, the core product that pays the bills. There isn't a much stronger statement that you can make, I think, as a tech company than to do that, right? Than to say, we believe in this tech, therefore we are building everything with this tech. So it's a pretty big deal for Shopify to do this. And we're using Vite as well to do that, right? So we are very, very aligned with Shopify as a company, with the other teams here at Shopify. They're excited about Remix. We're excited about, them and what they're building. So we're very, very well aligned. So, I see a lot of the dominoes kind of lining up here, for, Remix to have a nice long future and to do very, very well and to like grow as a technology, both in capabilities and in popularity. So yeah, those are the things that I'm just most excited about. And I think that, I think that, like Mark said this morning, like if you haven't tried it yet, if you haven't tried Remix yet, maybe this was a blocker for you. Maybe our compiler being closed was a blocker for you. Maybe you needed to do some custom stuff at that level. And you were just like, you're using styled components or whatever. And you were like, oh man, I can't use Remix. Well, that's no longer true. Like no matter what you're doing, no matter what your stack is like, you can absolutely use Remix. So we'd encourage you to give it a shot. We'd be honored if you did.
Sweet. Well, I think that's an amazing place to end it. So thank you so much, Pedro. Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Michael, for joining me. And I'm sure we're going to have lots more questions. So if you have those questions, please join us on the Discord, or you can try and tweet us. Or if you've run into an issue, of course, please create a GitHub issue and we'll try to fix it and make this thing better for everybody. So thanks so much.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Bye.